Hello, welcome to my research analysis project. I did my research analysis on a case study titled, "Does brain damage caused by stroke versus trauma have different neuropsychological outcomes?" A lesion-matched multiple case study by me, Barry Stillindahl. Let's get started. So, the context and background information for this case study. The aim of the study was to determine whether traumatic brain injuries, TBI, or stroke associated with different cognitive and behavioral outcomes. The data and participants included in this research study included 14 participants with TBI, 12 being male and 2 being female, and 27 participants with stroke, 17 male and 10 female. All participants came from the Iowa Neurological Patient Registry and had no additional traumatic neurological events, such as drug-alcohol abuse, psychiatric disease, or developmental disorders. All participants in the TBI sample group had a stable brain lesion and comprehensive neuroimaging and neuropsychological data. Additionally, all participants were studied as adults for both neuroimaging and neuropsychological data. Just for a little bit more information and context, a brain lesion refers to an area of the brain with abnormal tissue or damage, and a stable brain lesion refers to an area of the brain that is not actively shrinking or growing, also known as not actively progressing. Next is the hypothesis and main variables. So the hypothesis of this case study, there would be no significant differences in the neuropsychological outcomes between the TBI versus stroke groups when lesion location and size are controlled. All 41 participants participated in 14 different Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale WISE subtests. The 14 tests included the full-scale IQ, FSIQ, block design, similarities, digit span, matrix reasoning, vocabulary, arithmetic, symbol search, information, coding, letter number sequencing, comprehension, picture completion, and visual puzzles. The participants' results for these tests are the dependent variable for this experiment. The independent variable is the participants, as they are separated and grouped into TBI and stroke groups. So the procedure and research design for this case study. Stroke and TBI participants were matched based on the size and location of their brain lesion. Participants were matched on lesion size and location using a combination of neuroanatomical expertise and computerized voxel-based matching software in Excel. So a little bit more context. A voxel refers to a small 3D pixel in the smallest possible unit for 3D volume. Additionally, FSL's 3D visualization tools were used to visually compare the size and neuroanatomical location of the stroke and TBI lesions on coronal brain slices until 2 matches were selected. And what I mean by 2 matches selected, to go a little bit more in depth with that, let's say, for example, there was a TBI participant that had a brain lesion located on the left frontal lobe. That would mean that the participant's match would also need to have a damaged left frontal lobe. But instead of it being a TBI participant, it would need to be a stroke participant, as there needs to be 1 TBI participant and 1 stroke participant with the same brain lesion location for it to be considered a match. And out of the 41 total participants, 33 of them had unilateral brain lesions and the other 8 had bilateral brain lesions. And to go a little bit more in depth what that means, basically unilateral means it only affects one side of the brain, whereas bilateral affects both sides of the brain. And 50% of the participants had their brain lesions on the frontal lobe, which is kind of interesting. And all participants participated in the 14 subtests, with the raw scores being calculated for each test. This research study is experimental research, as the study includes a controlled independent variable being the TBI and stroke participants. The TBI and stroke participants are matched with each other under specific conditions, making them an independent variable, leading to it to be experimental research. So the results of this case study: overall traumatic brain injuries and strokes have different psychological mechanisms, but both have the potential to cause deficits in cognitive and behavioral functioning. So the case study results indicated that patients with TBI and stroke performed similarly on all cognitive and behavioral measures. There was no consistent pattern of the outcomes favoring one group versus the other. However, there were some test results where the mean scores were slightly better in the TBI group and some where the mean scores were slightly better in the stroke group. However, the results still showed no statistically or clinically significant differences in performance across patients with TBI and stroke. So in conclusion, mechanism of injury does not influence the neuropsychological outcomes in TBI and stroke patients with focal lesions when location and size are comparable across these groups. So how this case study relates to a psychological or a psychology concept. In this case study, approximately 50% of the participants had their brain lesions on the frontal lobe. Therefore, the study relates to the specific part of the brain called the frontal lobe. As described in the book, the frontal lobe is located toward the front of the brain and is responsible for reasoning, motor control, emotion, and language. After analyzing the case study's 14 different WISE tests and scores, the tests that received the lowest mean scores between all participants were related to the frontal lobe. For example, the letter numbering sequencing test received a very low mean test score from all participants, and I believe this test received such a low score due to the test requiring the use of the frontal lobe. And since 50% of the participants had their brain lesions in the frontal lobe, this meant a majority of the participants would score poorly on the test. So the broader psychological perspective would be that the case study is cognitive psychology. This case study relates to the cognitive psychology due to the in-depth studying regarding mental processes for TBI and stroke patients. The tests that the patients had to complete tested all parts of the brain, such as the frontal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe, and parietal lobe. Patients had a variety of brain lesion locations, which resulted in certain tests to be scored differently depending on the specific location of the brain lesion. If a patient were to score poorly on a test that focused on visual capabilities, it would be safe to assume that a brain lesion is located in the occipital lobe, as the occipital lobe is responsible for processing visual information. So my recommendation for future research would be to make this case study more thorough and more accurate. Increasing the sample size would help. As 41 total participants might not be enough. The end of the case study also mentioned that the majority of the participants were Caucasian, and this could be another limitation for the findings in this case study. Therefore, increasing the sample size and increasing a more racially diverse sample size could lead to a different study conclusion. The new hypothesis would be comparing cognitive performance between racially diverse TBI and stroke participants using neuropsychological tests. And here are my references. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video.